everyone. It is delightful to be here and wonderful to see faces. Some of you I know, some of you I don't know, and I'm just really happy to have a chance to talk with alumni. I always love talking with students, and then when everybody goes off into the world, it's great to have folks come back and get to reconnect. So go Gauchos, thanks for being here today. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing, and mostly I'm hoping we can then have some conversation, because I imagine that there are reasons that you came to this talk, and so you might have thoughts or questions to share, so we'll have a chance to do that. So the way that this all got started, this work that I'm doing on dialogue across political disagreement, after the 2016 election, it was clear to me and to pretty much anyone with any sense that our country was divided and that we were having a lot of trouble connecting across that divide. I'm a counseling psychologist. I'm a professor in the Department of Counseling, Clinical and School Psychology. And as a counseling psychologist, I'm always trying to figure out, how do we make things better? My research is not just about how do we understand people, it's about how do we actually improve people's lives. And so I started in 2016 then creating some resources, because I thought, well, what can I do to help with this situation about division? I'll create something. So the first resource that I created is something that I call the Flowchart that will resolve all political conflict in our country, because I'm optimistic like that. I think Michaela's going to post the link to that, so you'll be able to go and download it, because spoiler alert, it has not yet resolved all political conflict in our country. But I think that's just a distribution issue. So if you all just download it, share it with your friends, I think we're just going to have this all taken care of right away. So what you'll see in the flowchart is that one of the things I was trying to do is help people to make intentional decisions about whether or not they want to have conflict. And if they do, how do you do it in a way that you're going to have the greatest success at achieving your goals? And so flowcharts out there hadn't yet resolved all political conflict, because what I realized was the skills to get to those goals are not things that everybody already has. So then I went ahead and created a workshop, 2-hour skills building workshop. Several hundred people attended, all over Santa Barbara County, as well as outside of the area across the country. Community organizations, student leaders, political activists, faith communities. So lots of different kinds of people came to the workshop and got a lot out of it, but still seemed to want more resources. And so I was like, all right, I guess I'd better write a book. So that's what I did. I wrote this book, Beyond Your Bubble, How to Connect Across the Political Divide, Skills and Strategies for Conversations That Work. The book draws on it draws on psychological research, not just my research. It draws on research from many different people. And it draws on psychological skills also to inform dialogue. So it's evidence-based, it's really grounded in research, but it's written to be very accessible and engaging. And it's short enough not to be too daunting. So that was part of my goal, was to create a resource that was really accessible for everybody to be able to use. So I think if you can see me here, like here's the book. It's thin. It's it's easy to read. It's not a research article. This was published last summer of 2020. Turns out that was kind of timely in terms of dialogue across political lines with the election coming up. So I ended up getting to talk to a lot of people about the topic. And that was really exciting, because I just have to tell you, I've been doing research for 20 some years. Most of my research is on interventions to support LGBTQ folks. And I have never gotten this kind of press for any of the research that I've done. But you write a timely book, and it turns out that people want to talk to you, which is great, because I feel like this is something where I've been able to have some impact and try to be helpful in this situation. So let's get to the tips. This is a little bit of the background of how we got here, but what are a couple of things that might be helpful? So I'm going to distill the entire book in like 5 slides. So first of all, when I ask people, what their motivations are for coming to dialogue. What is it that you want to get out of dialogue? I hear the same things over and over again. There's someone in my life with whom I want to maintain a good relationship. Or people say, I want to persuade other people to see things the way I do. Or they say, I don't understand why people think or act or vote as they do. Some people are trying to find common ground. And some people say, I just want to help heal the political divide. So these are the consistent motivations that people tell me about. So here's the first tip. No matter which of these motivations you have, no matter what your goal is, the best thing that you can do is to promote understanding, because that is actually the path to achieve any of these goals. And so I'll talk a little bit about how do you do that. But first, I'm going to tell you how not to do that. Tip number 2 is you should engage with other people face to face, not Facebook to Facebook. So dialogue cannot happen in a social media environment. A lot of people feel like they're engaging with people on the other side because they're commenting on people's Facebook posts, or they're tweeting back to people, or I don't know what you do on TikTok, but maybe they're doing things there too. So what I know and what the research shows is that not only is it not going to be effective to communicate with somebody that way, it's not going to help you to reach any of your goals, it's actually more likely to create more distance between yourself and the other person, that rather than bringing them around to seeing your side, they're more likely to actually become more extreme in the other direction. So if you're worried about extremists, don't create more extremists by doing this kind of social media engagement. I think that really the only productive comment you can make on somebody's social media, if you disagree with them, is to say, I'm really interested to hear more. Can we set up a time to talk? Because actually that conversation is what's going to be really helpful. So you might be wondering, all right, let's say you get a chance to talk to somebody face to face. What is it that you should do? So one of the most important things that you can do is to listen. And the way that you should listen is by providing someone uninterrupted time to speak and then summarizing what you heard. You know what usually happens when we're listening is that you are listening and but really what's going on in your head is that you're thinking about what you're going to say back to the other person. And you're not necessarily paying attention to them completely. You're really paying attention a lot to how you're going to craft the argument that you're going to make that's going to convince them that that the way you're seeing things is right, and convince them that the way they're seeing things is wrong. Turns out that's not actually very helpful to reach any of those goals that you might have. So what you want to do is give somebody time to speak and then summarize what you heard them say. So they're saying their perspective. Instead of then sharing your perspective, you want to say, oh, this is what you think, rather than saying, this is what I think. So what else should you do? All right, well, what about when it's your turn to speak? How should you do that in a way that's going to be most productive? So when you're going to speak, what you want to do is to share stories rather than stats and slogans. So, noticing how you felt about something. I noticed I felt patriotic when I registered to vote for the first time. So sharing something about that story rather than saying voter suppression is wrong. That actually doesn't help you to reach any of your goals, but talking about your own experiences can be really helpful in terms of reaching those goals. And then what we're hoping somebody does on the other side, and what we're hoping you'll do when somebody shares that, is to be curious about the meaning, values, and experiences that people have. So there was a big deal that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. People had lots of strong reactions to it. One of the things you can ask is, how did you react to that? What meaning did that have for you? And a lot of people talked about patriotism, but they meant very different things by it. So we can be curious about, oh, well, you felt really patriotic, or you were upset because you felt like our country was under attack. people on all sides were saying that. So wanting to know more about, tell me more about what that meant to you, and to be curious. That's going to be helpful. Then you might notice that as someone's telling you these things, if they are very different from the way you see things, you might feel like your values are being attacked. You might feel like your identity is being challenged. You might feel your buttons being pushed. Your face is getting flushed. Your heart is racing. Your muscles are getting tensed. And so, what do you do in that situation? Well, what I'm going to recommend is something you already know how to do, is that you're going to breathe. Turns out we are breathing all the time. We're not always breathing in a way that's going to help us to stay engaged in conversation. So I'm going to show you how you should breathe. You should breathe like you are blowing bubbles. Let's say you have a little plastic bottle of bubbles, okay? The way you're going to breathe is you're going to take a deep breath in, and then you're going to exhale slowly. So everybody do it with me. Just imagine that you have a little thing of bubbles and a wand. Let's all do it together. So take a deep breath in, and then we're going to breathe out slowly. Okay, let's do it one more time. That's the way to breathe, to bring yourself back down to earth when you start getting riled up. Breathe in slowly, breathe out slowly and steadily, and just keep doing that. And that's actually going to help you to like get out of that fight, flight, or freeze response, and be able to stay engaged with somebody and try to achieve some of those goals that you have for dialogue. Okay, those are 6 quick tips. And so let me tell you, there's a bunch of other resources. Michaela's going to post things in the chat section. I try to provide lots of resources for folks. And so you can go to my website. Obviously, you can read my book. I've got a newsletter that I put out to try to give people some more resources. Download the Flowchart. You can follow me on social media. Also, Michaela's going to be posting a link to an article that I wrote on Medium, because there's a piece that I wrote that if you're like, I don't believe anything that you're saying, I want to see the data behind this, I want to see the research. It's got links to lots of things, but it's only a 4-minute read, so it will give you lots of good, hopefully, ideas and motivation for having dialogue with other folks. So that's what I have to share just to kick us off. Hopefully that has whet your appetite for having some conversation. And Michaela, you're going to let people know how they can ask questions and share and whatnot. But yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much. That was awesome. So I did drop those links in the chat to the website, the article, and then the talk in May. So those are in there. I really enjoyed that. I actually have a question. I guess I'll start us off. But if anybody else has a question, feel free to drop that in the chat and I'll read them out loud. Yes, we will be able to get a recording and the slides that'll be posted on our website next week. So yeah, so my question was in regards to the flowchart, do you suggest that this is something we share with someone before we have a conversation, or do you think it's more of like for personal use? Do you think we should have anyone we're conversing with take a look at that?
That's a great question. People are always like, well, what if I'm doing all of these things, but the person I'm talking to isn't? How do I get them to do all these things? So, my book makes a great gift, but probably the best thing that you can do is to model these things. And actually, people say, well, what if like their buttons are getting pushed? Like, how do I help to bring them back down? So actually, the same things that I'm telling you to do, listening, reflecting, keeping yourself calm, is also going to help to de-escalate the other person in terms of, if their emotions are getting amped up. So the same things that I'm telling you to do, just those are the things that you should do. And if the other person isn't doing them, you can't necessarily control other people's behavior. The only thing that you can do is your own. And trying to stay open and curious is going to help them actually want to engage with you more.
Great. Um, so one of our first questions in the chat is, if a lifelong friend voted for Trump, so we'll just say voted opposite of you in this scenario, and you feel that it's a betrayal of your shared values, how do you have a productive conversation?
That's a great question. I hear this a lot. So I would be curious about why they voted for Trump, or why they voted for whatever candidate they did, and to say, oh, I'm curious to hear more about that. One of the things that sometimes we forget is that we're often in these environments where we're hearing things about what something means from people who agree with us. So people will say, well, if somebody voted for this candidate, it means that they're racist and they're anti-immigrant. And if somebody voted for this candidate, it means that, they're, that they want to support abortion. And, that we have these ideas about what different actions mean. But when you have somebody who you're connected to who's taken a different action, you've got an opportunity to find out more about what it means from their perspective, not what it means from your perspective and from the perspective of people who agree with you. So I think it's actually an opportunity to find out more. And turns out often we have still those shared values, but maybe we've prioritized things in different ways. And often we cut off the conversation just at who did you vote for? And I think we're missing so much opportunity to really deepen our connections with people and understand people better.
Yeah, it's very easy to get heated about something that you're passionate about, and it's easy to turn to social media where all your friends agree with you. So very good points. Someone else said that these tips sound like good starters, but what do you do when things do get heated?
Mhm. So I think, again, keeping in mind, you can't necessarily control another person. You can control yourself. So what do you do about yourself? And some people will say, well, is it my job to stay calm all the time? Why do I always need to be calm? Is that tone policing? Is that, like sometimes I'm really upset about something and I feel like I have a right to be upset or a right to be angry. And I would say, yeah, totally. Like, I'm a psychologist. If I'm saying no, never have any emotions, that doesn't really fit. What I always do is go back to, what are your goals? And so I encourage you to think about, what are your goals for this conversation with this person? And it turns out, this was actually one of the greatest lessons I learned from writing this book. Sometimes people have multiple wants. Like, they want to maintain a connection with their cousin, but they also want to freely express what their views are. And those things sometimes come into conflict. So I think it's really important that you know what it is that you want, and that you make some intentional choices about what you're going to do with that. So you might decide in some circumstances, okay, it's really important for me to have this conversation with my cousin. So I'm having feelings, but maybe I'm going to go express them somewhere else. Sometimes, people are always telling me, I just want to be validated and I want to be heard and I want to be, understood. And I say, okay, you might need to go to somebody who already agrees with you to get those needs met initially. That maybe going to somebody who you disagree with isn't the first stop for that. But once you started into that relationship with somebody and you've laid some more of the foundation, you might end up getting more of that. But really, you want to think about, what's the goal of having a conversation with somebody who is on a different side of a political issue. And if what you're trying to do is get something out of it that you're not likely to get there, maybe you go somewhere else to get that particular need met. And you say, okay, in this situation, I'm going to try to, like, keep my cool so that I can stay in this and meet some of those other goals. How do you do that? You do that by breathing. There are exercises to sort of physically ground yourself that I describe in my book also, that anything that we can do that sort of reminds us to, like, what our goals are, and that what we're reacting to, often we're reacting to things as if as if every threat that we're experiencing is a saber-toothed tiger, because that's how our bodies were built, and when our bodies were built. But it turns out that most of the time it's not a saber-toothed tiger. And we might notice that we're having a reaction where we want to like fight or get out of there, or we just kind of like, our minds go blank. And sometimes we need to remind ourselves, oh, this isn't a saber-toothed tiger. Like, the worst thing that's probably going to happen in this situation is that someone's going to disagree with me, maybe in a loud voice. And I can handle that. I can live through that. And so that's one of the things, is to make those decisions. And sometimes you're going to decide, no, I can't handle that. I need to end this conversation. Or sometimes you're going to decide, you know what, my cousin's not worth it. I want to scream my head off. All right. But make a conscious, intentional choice about that.
Great tips. So our next question, how do you appropriately address an issue when you don't have time for an in-depth discussion / storytelling time? I would rephrase and say, if you don't want to, bring up statistics like you said, and bring up a lot of facts, like how do you have a brief but intentional discussion?
Yeah, and I'm saying, like, what if you just don't have time and it's a brief interaction? So I would say it depends a little bit. If it's a brief interaction with somebody you don't know very well, or who's not somebody who's in your life, and you're just, you're out in public, and somebody's wearing a mask, or they're not wearing a mask, or whatever it is that's really pushing your buttons right now, then I would say is, do you want to have that conversation at all? Because you want to ask, like, what are you trying to get out of that conversation? What's your goal? And so really think about, what's your goal, and is it possible that you're going to accomplish that in this brief interaction? You might decide that you're going to save your energy for another situation. If it's somebody who's in your life on an ongoing basis, then you've got an opportunity to just plant a seed. You're like, okay, I'm not going to get all the way there, but probably the best thing that you can do is express your caring and your curiosity, and not to like put out all of the information that you have, or even what your own view is, because that's not the thing that's probably going to help to stay connected with that person, or persuade them, or find common ground, or help to understand them. So listening, asking questions, expressing curiosity, and caring, those are really always the things to do.
Awesome. Another question we've got is, how do you respond when someone asserts that what they're saying is true but doesn't look at any contradictory facts?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm a researcher. I love facts. I love research. I love statistics. All of that stuff is great. And it turns out that what the science says is, don't talk about science. What the science says is, don't like trying to share facts is not what's going to help you to reach any of those goals. Again, it's about curiosity, and it's about listening, and what are you trying to accomplish here? And the one of the things that can be helpful is actually asking other people to elaborate on things. Like, rather than saying, no, this is what you should think, saying, oh, I'm curious to hear more about that. Like how does that work? Or, I'm curious about where that information is from, but not in a challenging way. You've got to come at it from a way of curiosity. It's this really it's a complex skill in some ways. These skills sound so simple. It's like all you have to do is just listen and reflect back to somebody what they just said, and breathe. Like, who can't do that, right? But it's really hard, because what our initial response to is sort of going in it like it's a debate, because that's what we see. We see debate on TV. People like, this person makes their point, this person makes their point, for outside observers to evaluate. There's no outside observer in dialogue. It's just you and another person. So it's not about crafting the right argument with all the right information. It's about the relationship. That's the most important thing.
Awesome. Someone in the chat shared some personal experience, and followed by a question. So this says, My twin brother has begun to embrace extremism and conspiracy theories. We have an unspoken agreement to not discuss anything political. I think we would no longer have a relationship if we did. So avoidance seems like the only way to not kill each other. I imagine you might say that this is conflict avoidance and is not necessarily helpful, but I don't need the high intensity pushing of buttons that would give us both sleepless nights. What would you advise?
I think not killing each other is so great. Well done. I think that's a fantastic approach, and it honestly sounds like you found a way that's working for you. So if you feel like you've got the relationship and you're not going to approach politics, this is, being able to have dialogue across political disagreement is an opportunity. It's never a mandate. You never have to have these conversations. Probably where I see the greatest opportunity is when people say, "Oh, I can't talk to that person, because they voted this way or they did this thing, but I want to maintain a relationship, or I want to persuade them, or I want to find common ground, and so I'm struggling with it." So that's where I can say, "Oh, okay. Well, here are the things that you can do." If and I see people sometimes cutting off those opportunities too quickly. If if you feel like this is the situation that's going to work best for us, I would say then that's what you should go with. Um, and and when there are opportunities and you want to have conversation, it doesn't always have to be about politics, and you might have found that already. Like, we can actually have relationships with other people where politics is not the only thing that there is. Like, maybe you care a lot about each other's kids, maybe you have some similar interests in terms of sports or TV shows or anything, and that's really important too. And then when there are opportunities, or if you decide that you want to talk about politics, you've got that foundation of the relationship, and that's going to be helpful.
Great. I'm going to skip a couple of questions, but I will go back because this one piggybacks off of that last question. If you've been avoiding someone or not seeing them, and you realize the only way forward is avoidance in order to be in the same room, how do you begin to rebuild a new relationship without having to confront the elephant in the room?
So I learned something interesting when I was looking at the research. This was actually after I wrote the book. There's newer stuff that's come out, because we think about political polarization as being polarization between people on the left and people on the right. It turns out that there's this other kind of polarization going on, and they call this affective polarization. And that's between people who are really into politics and really emotionally engaged with it, the political junkies on the left and the right, versus people who like don't get that charged about politics. And this is one of those things to know about yourself. Where are you on that? Are you somebody who's like really your buttons are pushed about politics and your emotions are very elevated around it, or not so much? The reason that it's helpful to know this is that if you're if you're one of those people who's got the more elevated emotions around politics, it turns out that people at those extremes actually don't have as clear a perspective about people on the other side, or about people in the middle even, and might sort of feel more charged and like, I can't possibly be in the room with somebody, and it's pushing my buttons and all of that. Sometimes because our understanding of who that other person is or is likely to be is really distorted. So that's one of the things that I talk about in that Medium article. So you might go take a look at that, because if we have this distorted understanding of who this other person is, like, we're often thinking about, if somebody voted this way, or if somebody says this thing, or if somebody says Black Lives Matter, or if somebody says all lives matter, whatever that is, we think, like, we paint a picture in our head of what that means that person is. And often that's a very skewed understanding of that person. So that's the other thing that I would say about the extremists. Sometimes you actually know somebody's really extremist because of some things, but often we're distorting this lens of how we're understanding somebody else. So I guess what I would say is, like, give it a try and be curious and try having a conversation and understanding more about somebody and seeing where they are. The worst thing that's going to happen is that they'll confirm what you already think to be true. But the best thing that can happen is they can actually perhaps help you to undistort your lens.
Awesome. Great conversations happening in the chat, by the way. Another person said, do you have any examples of how these tips have worked, and how they've made a difference? Any, I guess, concrete
Sure.
examples?
Yeah. So I have a friend whose brother was dying, and it's the middle of a pandemic and needed someone to care for him. And so she agreed to do that, but they were in very different political camps. And so she was like, I need to do this, but I don't know how I'm going to be able to tolerate, his political opinions. And she got my book and she said, Tanya, this is calming me down so much just reading this, because it was helping her to have a better understanding of some of the ways that, she might, have that kind of distorted view, but also was giving her concrete skills so that she felt like, okay, maybe I can go and do this. So she did end up going and being with him for the end of his life. And not only being with him, but also being with his friends who are also on that other side of the political spectrum. And she said she really grew to, have a fondness for them because of that shared experience that they were in. So that's an example of, they weren't necessarily talking about politics, but they were sometimes talking about politics. And it just helped her to have a more open heart to them and be able to do the thing that she wanted to do and felt like she needed to do for a family member.
Well, that's really great to hear. Another question says, thank you for your caring and curiosity approach. Any ways to engage younger audiences who feel like they know it all?
I know, right? But don't we all think that on some level? But I remember when I thought I knew it all. I was a terror when I was about 24 years old. So how do we engage younger people? Well, I think we can also be curious about where they're coming from. And we can also tell them our stories. I think we can, there's different contexts and we can acknowledge that. We can say, oh yeah, I recognize there's this very different context that you're growing up in than what I grew up in. This is kind of what it looked like when I was growing up. And also you can talk about, like, maybe your perspectives have changed over time and to share some of that. So share your stories, and listen to their stories. Like, their stories are really interesting too. And the other thing that I always know about, like, as I've gotten older, as I become aware of different things over time, is the moment before I was aware of whatever it is, I wasn't aware of it. And so I try to sort of think, okay, well, how would I want someone to have talked to me about this then? And so try to give them what it is that you would have wanted, which would probably have been someone to be curious about your perspective and maybe to share some of their stories, but certainly not to tell them that they're wrong.
Great. This is a question for me, actually. How would you suggest engaging in conversation with people who consider themselves more politically moderate or someone who doesn't want to engage in politics? Because I personally feel that sometimes even something that doesn't feel political can get politicized, and it's hard to know what's okay to talk about with those types of people who don't necessarily want to engage in political discussion.
Yeah, and so one thing is that some people just don't follow what we consider politics that much. And so they're, things just aren't on their radar. And it often feels like a quiz to them, when we're like, did you see this story? And like, so that's not a great way to approach people who aren't so into politics. The other thing is to notice what's going on with your emotional state, because those people who are on the not so emotional side of the affective polarization spectrum, the last thing that they want to do is talk to somebody who's really charged up about stuff. So just kind of trying to like maintain your cool and your calm is really helpful. Politics is a lot of different things. Some of what it is its values and its experiences and it's people's different takes on things, and you can find out more about that. You can be curious about that. Oh, well, tell me what happened to you when. Oh, when you were growing up, what did you hear about this issue, or what was your interaction with these kinds of people, and just find out more about that. Be curious. And honestly, I found it to be so much more interesting in terms of a conversation to have rather than just like batting back and forth, like, what's your hot take on the thing that happened yesterday? Well, there was a big thing that happened yesterday. So think about having more interesting and complex conversations that aren't just about what's currently in the news, because politics is about so much more than that. It's about what we believe in and what we care about.
Thank you. I'm just going to do one or two more questions. So if anybody has a last minute one, drop that in the chat. Someone asked, do you think that conversations about politics are appropriate in the workplace or to have with colleagues?
Yes, because we always are. I mean, we're talking about things that we care about, things that we do that reflect, what we care about. It's not necessarily, like I said, politics is about lots of things. I don't think it's appropriate to talk about partisan politics or candidates. I mean, I draw a very clear line about that in my classes and with my students, because this is, because the university, like, we're not supposed to be using the university resources for partisan advocacy or for candidates, and we shouldn't be. And so I won't use my email for that. I don't talk about that in class. And at the same time, there are policies and there are things that are happening that are appropriate to talk about. So I think we need to draw a clear line. Here are the things that we don't talk about, in the university environment. Here are the things that we can. So now some of you are like, but there's lots of other workplace environments. So again, I would say, what's your motivation? Like, what's your goal? What are you trying to do here? So I also always think about, in any environment, I'm just going to assume that there are people here who don't agree with me on this. So if I'm assuming that, how do I want to talk about this thing? Or do I want to talk about this thing? I think one of the problems that happens is we often speak as if we're assuming that everybody's on the same page that we are. And that really can make some people feel alienated and, create all kinds of tensions that you don't want in the workplace or anywhere else.
So last question. Thank you to everyone who put them in the chat. Sorry if I didn't get to yours or if I missed it, but last question. It feels like, someone says, it feels like my friends' values have changed. They won't get vaccinated, resent wearing masks, etc. Hard to want to talk about their family or shared UCSB memories when this happened. Do you have any advice for that?
Oh, such a good question. I see there's a bunch of things about getting vaccinated and wearing masks and all of that, because this is like the political conflict of this very moment as we are where we are in the pandemic. I feel like a lot of people I know, well, really everybody sort of made their decisions about how to deal with the pandemic. And anything that people were doing that was either more or less than exactly what we each decided to do was like intolerable, because we all had our reasons that we came up with for doing what we decided to do. And so it feels like a challenge if somebody's, like being more restrictive in who they're seeing than we are, then it makes us feel like, oh, like I'm not being careful enough. And if somebody's being less restrictive, then we're like, but you're putting my life in danger, So this seems to happen no matter exactly what people decided to do, that whatever else other people are doing was super problematic. So that's one thing that I'll say is, let's recognize that if that's something that we're feeling. The other thing that I'll tell you about is perspective taking, because I do a lot of work on trying to understand where somebody else might be coming from and trying on different ways of thinking about things. So I want to talk about, I'm going to be super risky here and talk about things in a potentially very inflammatory way. Won't that be a great way to end? Um, so I was thinking about this whole thing with getting vaccinated and how a lot of people on the left I'm hearing say, like being so upset about people not getting vaccinated, and think, saying like, but you're putting other people in danger, and you shouldn't be doing that. So I'm just going to observe that the same people who are saying that are all my pro-choice people also, that these are all the pro-choice people who say that just, a woman's body, her decision should be, between herself and her doctor. And I'm like, wow, that's an interesting, perhaps, contradiction. I'm just going to tell you that's my side too. So I'm not critiquing anyone but like my own side of the divide here. Um, but I don't think that we usually try on that different perspective. I don't think we usually try it on and go, oh wow, like, is that, like, maybe somebody's saying the same thing they're saying, like, this is my body and I'm making a choice about my own body. And like, isn't that what you're always saying that we should do? Yeah, I know. Then people will be like, but why do you think that about abortion? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. We can throw back and forth a million gotchas. And I see people doing that all the time, saying the way you're thinking is not like logically consistent. And the truth is, none of it is. None of it is. Whatever it is that all of your values and your thoughts are, people can poke holes in it, and they will, and they can. What I'm really curious about in having these conversations is, oh, tell me your perspective, because I know that my perspective is limited. All of our perspectives are limited. Don't you want to know something more? I know what my students are like at UCSB. They are wildly curious. They want to learn. And I know that you all are still like that, but we forget what we can learn from other people in this way. We can learn another perspective that we don't already have. We don't have to take on that perspective. But my gosh, it's such a shame if that perspective is out there and there's someone right in front of us who could help us understand, and we don't take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you so much for all the insightful comments and the tools. I think that's really great. It's really great that we all got to have this brief discussion, a little therapy session at the end of the day. Everyone who shared stories and questions in the chat, thank you so much for doing that. You guys, the attendees, really make this event when you ask thoughtful questions, so that's really wonderful of you guys. I'm putting Dr. Israel's resources in the chat once again, just so that everyone can get those if they want. I will also drop in the Gaucho Network link and the link to our website in case anyone wants to check that out after we log off. Dr. Israel, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we let everyone go?
Just the things that are in the chat section are, if you want to go to my website, if you want to read that article, but also on May 6th, I'm going to be doing another thing with UCSB alumna. And so if you are interested in coming to that, we're going to be talking about this sort of intersection between the things that I do, about how to use dialogue to advocate for LGBTQ rights. So that should be a really interesting conversation. Good follow-up.